It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Ruth Vecht. Your maiden name was Beer, and you come from Denmark originally, and here we're in your beautiful home in Hendon in England. And Ruth, if you could just relate the story.
Okay, so I'm Danish, but I wasn't born Danish. My parents came from Frankfurt in Germany, and when Hitler came to power, my parents, who lived in Berlin at the time, decided on the 31st of March in 1933, as Hitler became Chancellor, they decided this was no place to bring up little Jewish children. They had 2 boys at the time, and they decided to flee that day. My father said to my mother, look, if you get permission to leave, we will go today. It was a Friday, and they were Mechalel Shabbos in order to leave. They lived in a posh flat. They had maids, they had Mercedes that was waiting downstairs to take my father to business. They closed the flat, told the girls, the maids, to go, packed 2 suitcases and left Berlin and went to Denmark, which is how I came to be born in Denmark. Now, they lived, I'll come to this later, but there is a good reason why Danish Jews in particular don't talk much about what happened to them, because unlike the rest of Jews in most of Europe, with a few exceptions, they were saved, and they were saved because the Danes looked after them. I think we're always somewhat embarrassed by our good fortune. Other people have lost entire background, families, anybody that was anybody. They grow up with a family that has got seemingly no forebears. They grow up without uncles, aunts, cousins. We were the lucky ones. And I'm not only talking about the 6 million who were murdered, I'm also talking about the people who were left with scars that never really healed. And in Denmark, it was different. There are good individuals everywhere, but the Danes were different in the sense that being decent, being human, that was just what you were. There was nothing to it. The Danes themselves never thought of it as anything very special. They thought this was a thing to do. These people who were suddenly being singled out, they were human beings. They were Danish. In our case, we were stateless, but they were human beings. There was no way they were going to be singled out, and the Jew and the king did not wear a yellow star, unlike what you've heard probably on various books or whatever it was. He did not wear a yellow star. What he did say was that if anybody was going to wear a yellow star, he would be the first to do it, and therefore all the Danes would be wearing it, so there was no point. The Germans attacked Denmark on the 9th of April. Denmark is a small peninsula on top of Germany. I don't know if you know the map, but it's on top of Germany. It's got a lot of little islands all dotted around. It had at that time 4 million people, a very small and limited army. There was no point in fighting. The Danes were occupied by the Germans, and there was nothing to be done. Now, however, Denmark was lucky in the sense that it was also the larder of a large part of Europe. The Danes produced bacon, eggs, milk, cheese, butter, you name it, we had it. And the Germans wanted to keep Denmark as a source of nourishment nearby, easily reached by railway. There was a good reason for keeping the Danes relatively happy. So the normal things, normal life carried on. Normal life, the courts, the police and the armed forces continued under Danish jurisdiction. Hitler also saw the Danes as fellow Aryans. All those lovely blonde children and those good-looking girls with blue eyes, they were almost ideal Germans. In fact, they could be considered more German than Germans themselves. And so, somehow or other, with a very muddled ideological message, the Jews were left alone for many years. For the Jews, it meant that all organizations, synagogues, schools, social clubs and Zionist associations continued as before. The old Danish Jews, who had lived there for many generations, could not believe the rumors from the rest of Europe. And certainly not, it couldn't happen in Denmark. My mother, who was at that stage a refugee from Germany, was phoned by a member of those Danish Jews, who said, "Oh, Mrs. Beer, I've been thinking so much about you recently." The idea that the same thing could happen to them was literally unthinkable. But things changed. 3 years later, by August 1943, the Germans victorious conquering one country or another slowed down. Hitler lost the Battle of Stalingrad, the German offensive in North Africa collapsed, and the Allied forces invaded Italy. Perhaps the 1,000-year Reich could be defeated. The Germans themselves were beginning to harbor secret doubts. The Danish resistance movement grew in size and daring, and sabotage became a daily event. Hitler was furious. His protected friends were not behaving like friends at all. Anyone caught with arms should be automatically sentenced to death. There should be measures against the Jews. The Danish government rejected Berlin's ultimatum, and there was a general strike and now open hostility. The names and addresses of the Jewish community were on list, and they had been removed from the community office by the sensible Jewish leadership, but the Germans found another list just with names and dates. Now, all they had to do was look them up in the telephone directory. By now, it was only a question of time when we were going to be rounded off. But there was another angle to it. Dr. Werner Best, the official head of the German occupation and a committed Nazi since 1930, with a horrendous record of terror in Poland, was now playing a dangerous double game. He was kowtowing to Hitler on one side and suggesting Jewish deportation, and at the same time assuring the Danish authorities that the Jews were safe. It was impossible to work out what was the true situation. The rumors were flying around, but the Jews were told time after time they were not in danger. Till Mr. Duckwitz, the commercial naval attaché, went to warn the future Danish Prime Minister Hans Hedtoft that disaster would happen on the 1st of October 1943, Rosh Hashanah. As far as we know, Dr. Best knew about this move. If he didn't actually encourage it, he may have considered his future should Germany lose the war. 2 big troop ships were at the port, ready to take us to an unknown destination. Hans Hedtoft was the leader of the Danish community, a venerable and most highly respected top lawyer who responded to this warning with, he went to the leader of the lay leader of the Jewish community, and he said what was going to be and what was going to happen. There was going to be a razzia, and Mr. Henricus, a member of the old Danish Jewish community and the leader of the Kahela, said, "You're lying." But it was true, and now all had to be warned by word of mouth. On 2 days before Rosh Hashanah, on Erev Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi Dr. Marcus Melcher interrupted the morning service in the synagogue, telling those present that by tonight, all Jews, old, young, the strong, the weak, healthy or sick, they must all hide. and not be in their own homes. Everyone must be warned and told. By night, most had disappeared. How? Some went to their Gentile friends. Messengers from the resistance movement went from home to home. Hospitals sent out ambulances, and Mr. Cohen changed to Mr. Hansen or Jensen and was put to bed in the hospital. Suddenly the hospitals were full of ill people. The schools were warned through their pupils. Unknown people gave Jews their addresses and keys to their homes. In Denmark, people live in flat buildings, fairly small flat usually, but very often they have little summer houses out in the country. And people would go around with the keys to their summer house and inviting anybody who was Jewish or looked Jewish or they knew they were Jewish, please use my summer house. One woman got 4 sets of keys. Taxi drivers picked up bereft Jews and took them home. The old Danish Jews could not believe what was happening to them and had to be forced out of their homes. There was the unbelievable fate of 2 elderly ladies who went to the Gestapo. They were law-abiding and politically totally naive, who went to the Gestapo with, "We have heard you're looking for Jews." Yes, we're looking for Jews. "Well, we are Jewish. Go home, pack your things and come back," which they did, and they were sent to Theresienstadt. The University of Copenhagen suspended all lectures for a week so that students could help their fellow citizens to safety. The bishop sent a protest to the Nazis and a pastoral letter to be read out in the churches on the 3rd of October, saying we must obey God before we obey man. The clergy opened their homes and churches for a refuge. King Christian sent a letter to Dr. Best, which was sent to Ribbentrop, in which he protested that any special measures against the Jews who had full civil rights here for the last 100 years would have the most serious consequences. The huge communal hospital had 1,000 staff, doctors, nurses and supporting staff, who all cooperated to hide Jews. Maternity wards, orthopedic, attics, it didn't matter where, all got nice Danish names. The GPs told their patients to go to hospital to be looked after. Cross-country runners combed the woods around Copenhagen and found families in hiding and took them to hospital. 2,000 were saved this way. Transport to Sweden was arranged little by little, but most people had reached safety by the end of October. Now, what about money? The fishermen along the coast of Sjælland were the main means of transport. The crossing at the narrowest point between Denmark and Sweden was the most dangerous and easiest to detect. The fishermen ran unknown risks. There was no way of knowing how the Germans would treat them if caught. Their lives, their livelihood, their boats, their tackle, and they weren't catching fish either. And the whole exercise was extremely stressful. They had wives and children at home and desperate people in their boat, so they charged, some no doubt too much. The amount varied. The rich paid more and the poor paid less, but no one was left behind for lack of money. But what was money worth when lives were at stake? Money was hastily collected from wealthy sources. Loans were guaranteed to help raise the necessary funds. The police, which in other countries was very much on the German side, were helpful in complete contrast to their official duties. They didn't see what they saw. They turned a blind eye to the obvious traffic. Often they were actively involved, especially the harbor police. Sometimes a young, diligent officer would arrest refugees, only to be stopped by his superiors, who took the prisoners to safety in their own cars. The resistance movement organized oversaw, assisted, transported and guarded their fellow Jew citizens. The German army had been in Denmark now for a long time and had sort of been Danified, if I could put it like that. And they were unwilling to take part in the hunt, considering the task of deportation as below their dignity. They were at war. They were not at war with a lot of bedraggled men, women and children. They were soldiers. The hastily imported Gestapo, the hardcore Nazis, were too few and too unsupported to carry out the task that had been given by Berlin. The sound between Denmark and Sweden was strangely uncontrolled. Altogether, 464 Jews were caught and sent to Theresienstadt. None of them were sent to extermination camps. This was agreed between Dr. Best, Eichmann and Ribbentrop in November 1943. You find another country where this happened. A most unusual decision. Nonetheless, sadly, 51 of the prisoners died in the camps. The rest returned to Denmark to a jubilant reception at the border, greeted with flowers, food, hot showers and private homes. They were fetched by the white buses and driven to Sweden 3 weeks before the end of the war and taken to Malmö. And so, at the end of the rescue, Hitler was told that Denmark was Judenrein. It was free, it was purge of Jews. When he heard about the 7,350 Jews who got away, he had one of his insane tantrums. So that's a story about what happened politically and generally. And now, if you wish, I can carry on with the story of what happened to us.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Ruth, and how old were you at the time when this occurred?
I was 7, but I'll tell you that when we're going through this, yeah? So in 1933, my parents lived in Berlin, and they were member of the Austrittsgemeinde, which is roughly the forerunner of what's Munch's in London and Breuer's, I think, in America. They had a beautiful flat, maids for everything and all the rest of it. But my father was very smart, and he had read Mein Kampf by Hitler and taken completely seriously the murderous intention toward the Jews. So that's why when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and democratically elected, don't forget, my father knew his world had changed. My mother stood on the balcony in Berlin with her 2 little boys, aged 2 and 3, and watched the stormtroopers march by to a jolly tune where the lyrics went, "Wenn Judenblut von Wasser spritzt, dann geht's noch mal so gut," which means something like, "When Jewish blood sprays from the knife, then everything is twice as good." And she thought, what am I doing here with 2 little Jewish boys? It was the 31st of March 1933, a Friday. My father phoned, "If you get permission for the police to leave, we're going today." So she went to the police station and came with a story about wanting to go on holiday in Denmark where she had a brother. The policeman asked, "Are you Jewish?" "Yeah." He bit his lip and gave her written permission. We still have the document. They packed 2 suitcases, sent the maids away, closed the door to the flat, and went with the boys to the station and took the train to Denmark. In Denmark, my father wasn't permitted to work in the field of his work for 5 years. So they moved into a boarding house where all 4 of them shared one room. This was a big departure from their previous life. They ate vegetables, and sometimes my mother was allowed to cook some meat in her own pans, but they were always a bit hungry, and spent their days in cafes making a coffee last a very long time. Friends and relatives would come from Berlin and Frankfurt, simply not understanding how my parents could live like that. One of them exclaimed, "But Alice, when I think of my lovely flat in Berlin and I see how you live, all you still need is a goat." My parents begged them to leave Germany, but in vain. And so they went back to live comfortably and dangerously. After all, the Germans were civilized. Their culture, writers, scientists, painters, composers, universities. The Beers were crazy. After some years, my parents moved to a flat. The family grew. 3 more children. I, my little sister, and my little brother. 5 in all. Once more, they were maids, but my mother had to cook. My father watched her morosely, cookery book in one hand and stirring the pot with the other, and muttered, "One day I'm going to die of a printing error." One of my earliest memories from the 9th of April 1940. I was just 4 and came in to my mother, normally so happy, who was crying in bed. "Why are you crying?" "The Germans have come." "What does it mean? Why are you crying?" "They don't like Jews." But our lives didn't change then, not then. We lived in the road that led to the royal palace. Every day, King Christian X would ride out on his big strong horse. He was loved and respected by all. He didn't need guards. His people, pedestrians and cyclists, were his guards. He didn't see a problem with this and continued his rides throughout the German occupation. On one of my father's walks with me, a German SS officer stopped and, pointing to me, explained to his friend, "Here you see a typically Aryan child." I was blonde then. "Can you stop it for a minute?" "Here you see the typically Aryan child." And that was me. So you can get going again if you like. But then one day I heard my mother cry again. This time much worse. She was beside herself. Her favorite brother Julius had been caught and sent to a concentration camp. This was 1942. She wept and shouted, "I wish he were dead, I wish he were dead, it would be better for him." My father's blue cigarette smoke filled the room. The sun was streaming in, and my mother wished Julius was dead? I was 6, and now I knew exactly how dangerous the Germans were. Surely the Germans could see my father was Jewish. What if they caught him? I did a detailed study of noses. My father's was large, bent, and fairly slim. The Danes also had big noses, but they were more knobbly and spread over more of their faces. I pretended to play soldier, walking up and down with a stick for a gun. It was important for me that the grown-ups should think that I was playing, when I was really just waiting and hoping he hadn't been caught. And then I spotted him, right at the end of the road. Good, he was safe, and I could stop pretending. The Germans stole our beautiful modern school for over 1,000 children and used it as a barracks for their soldiers. We had to go to school in an old hospital with dark rooms and a tiny playground. I'd just been given a new school bag by my parents with a backpack with rusty brown foalskin, soft to stroke on the outside. But then, in October 1943, my mother was crying again. But she had a steely intensity I had never seen before. "Get up, now!" "But I'm ill," I protested. "Now! Put this on. 3 vests, 6 pairs of knickers, a blouse, a skirt, a dress, a coat." I could barely move. She put pieces of soap in our pockets and combs and toilet paper and said strange things like, "When you arrive, perhaps you can exchange it for food." What was she talking about? By now, no one was pretending. The Germans wanted to catch us. It was Erev Rosh Hashanah. The challah and the roast beef were put in the empty space of the baby's pram. Then there was a mattress, and on top, Dodo, 6 months old. My sister Eva was 2. I was 7, and the big boys 13 and 14. I said goodbye to my room and the school bag in the corner. That morning, the warning had been given in the synagogue by Rabbi Melcher. My father thought, where could he possibly take his family? 7 people. The youngest might cry and give us all away. Where could we hide? Then he had an idea. An acquaintance of his, the director of the most elegant department store in Copenhagen, Ilum, had an envelope on his desk addressed to the Lord of the Manor, Paul Alsing. He went to see Mr. Alsing. I'll show you a picture of Mr. Alsing. Here he is. Have you got it? Hang on. He went to see Mr. Alsing. Perhaps we could sleep in one of his barns? Paul always had a glint in his eye, but this time he must have suppressed a smile. He picked up his phone and called Esther, his wife. And here she is.
And her name was Esther?
Yeah. Now, thereby lies an interesting tale. She was a quarter Jewish. But this was never thought about. Can we take 7 people tonight? But of course, came the answer. We divided the family in 3 parties. I went with my father and Eva. We took the train out of Copenhagen, going north, and got off barely half an hour later. Just here, I asked him, but it's much too close to town. He shrugged. It's supposed to be here. It was the right address, but there was no manor house, no barns. It was a very nice but normal 4-bedroom villa with a garden. The Alsings had sent their own 3 teenage daughters to friends so they could take in an unknown family with 5 children. In Norway, which had also been occupied by the Germans, people who helped Jews risked their sharing their fate. There was no way at that time to know how dangerous the actions of the Alsings were. The Germans could change from civility to murder at a whim, but they seemed hardly to consider their own risk. They just wanted to do what needed to be done, and they did it with such charm. Esther listened patiently to our dietary requirements. Paul adored little children and drew up a mutual and deep friendship with my little sister. I was allowed to watch Paul in his carpentry shop in the basement. The daughters came in during the day and played piano for us. We had to be quiet. A week later, it became too dangerous for so many to stay together, so my parents and big brothers left in the night. But where should they go? During the summer holidays, we had rented some summer cottages next to a minicab driver and his wife. My parents went there in the middle of the night. My mother knocked on the window. "Mr. Christensen, Mr. Christensen." And out of his deep sleep, he said, "Mrs. Beer." And then he came padding out in his socks, let them all in, and kept them for the next 3 days. By this time, transport had been arranged for us all to Sweden and safety by boat. Here, I want to interrupt the story to tell you about Mr. Christensen. After we had safely escaped to Sweden, Mr. Alsing went to tell him the good news and at the same time put 500 kroner on the table to thank him for his trouble. This was an unimaginable sum for a minicab driver. Mr. Christensen pushed the money back with the words, "Oh no, that would take all my pleasure away." Meanwhile, coming back to us. Meanwhile, I'd woken up and find the others had left. Now it was my turn to cry. I was quite simply overwhelmed by the responsibility I felt for my sister and brother. It was too much. I couldn't manage. But Esther calmed me down. She would look after us. Once more, on Kolnidra night, I had to put on all my runaway clothes. They drugged the 2 little ones so they would sleep deeply for many hours. Paul took us in a taxi a long, long way through dark forests. Then we stopped and had to get into another taxi. I was a bit scared, but Paul was there. We arrived at a little pebble beach, and there, in the moonlight, next to a rowing boat, was my dad. We rowed out to a larger boat lying further out. All you could hear was the oars and the water. Otherwise, complete silence. We were the very last passengers. The fishing boat was crammed full of people, inside the hold, on deck, absolutely everywhere. "Here," said my dad, and indicated a little space about 30 centimeters. "You can stand here and hold on here." He pointed to a piece of railing. I looked straight down at the water clucking beneath. It was a long way down, and I thought, if I fall in, I mustn't shout, just drown quietly. "I am not staying here." He shrugged, and I was allowed down into the hold. One more body squeezed among the others. The boat started. All you could hear was the motor and the water. The woman I was most squeezed against was comfortably fat and soft. It went on for hour after hour, and then suddenly the night was split open by a deafening roar. It was like a blinding flash splitting the dark sky. What was it? What was it? Were they all mad? The woman against whom I'd been pressed for the last many hours said they were singing. Singing? Yeah, they were singing Du gamla du fria, the Swedish national anthem. We were in Swedish water. We were safe. But then we landed, and jumping towards us were soldiers in grey-green uniforms. So we betrayed after all, I thought, resigned. But then they spoke Swedish, not German, and they were nice and put us up in some sort of refugee camp with mattresses on the floor. The others were still fasting, but the children got thick Swedish pancakes with jam and hot cocoa to drink. It was amazing. The next 20 months were spent in Stockholm. We lived in a disused office with no kitchen or bathroom. The baby slept in a beer box, later in an open drawer. 3 of us got measles just before Pesach. Dodo cried all night and day unless my mother held him and sang a German lullaby where the repeat went, "Hei du, hei hopp, das hat konnte artig sein, jetzt bellt alle Tage und brummt nach oben rein," which I don't need to translate since it's all rubbish anyway. My shoes led in snow and slush because one of the soles had come away from the uppers, and I developed a special gait where I flipped the foot forward and so the sole wouldn't curl up underneath. It was fine, everything was fine. We were not in a prison camp, we were together, we were alive and safe. And then, one day, there were huge headlights on the kiosk in the street. They were at least 10 centimeters high. "Hitler's dead. The Allies had won. The war was over." 3 weeks later, I stood on deck on the boat going back to Denmark and thought, this is the happiest day in my life. When I grow up, I'll have lots of children and tell them you can go anywhere in the world with absolutely nothing and still be a good Jew. We arrived back in the flat. There was a special Danish cake on the kitchen table from the lady in the dairy saying, "Welcome home." I ran into my room, and there, exactly where I'd left it, was my school bag. The war was over. But if my parents hadn't had the courage of their conviction, if the king hadn't been so loyal, if the Danes hadn't known right from wrong as a whole nation, if the Alsings and the Christensen hadn't taken us in, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu looked after us, I wouldn't be telling you this story now. That's the end.
Ruth, it's amazing. It's something unbelievable. You have a picture of your parents.
Right, my parents. Okay, here are my parents.
So reading Mein Kampf actually, in a way, saved the family.
He was intelligent. Being intelligent is always good.
And Ruth, you have a picture of your it's your great grandparents.
Yeah. As you see. Yeah?
It's amazing. Ruth, I just want to thank you. If you
have you switched off?
No, we must just, I just want to thank you. If you could I'm so grateful to you, Ruth.
It's a pleasure. No, it's a good story.
You know, if only it would have happened more. If only...
Well, the Italians... What are you doing?
I just want to thank you.
The Italians were very good. A lot of the Italian Jews were hidden.
This is the story of your...
Yeah.
So Ruth, I'm so grateful to you.
Not at all.
There are no words to express my appreciation, and your story, it's unbelievable how...
It is a Danish story, and it's a good story.
It's an exceptionally good story how people were just did the right thing.
Yeah.
And the community was unified, and it's...
If you think about this hospital with 1,000 people working there, nobody betrayed anyone.
It's amazing. And what's also incredible, when you came home, it wasn't ransacked. They left.
No, I think Mr. Alsing paid our rent.
It's just amazing.
I never wanted any thanks.
And it wasn't for money.
And until this year, I was still in touch with one of his daughters.
Wow.
But she died this year. But we had this very close relationship.
Well, Ruth, I'm so grateful to you, and you should just have Mazel Brocha and
Thank you.
Admei Vesrim. And I'd like to ask if you could just give a message which you impart to your children and grandchildren, having gone through what you went through.
Well, I didn't go through a lot. I mean, it was a very... I mean, if you sort of think about it, it was not a great long sob story. It was a good experience.
But what message would you impart to your...
I think the message I had on the ship was, you can go anywhere and still be a good Jew. You can have nothing and still be a good Jew. I've seen my parents fasting on Yom Kippur, fleeing, and seeing them, you know, I had seen my parents living a Torah life no matter where they were.
And can I ask, your parents, their siblings and their relations that remained in Germany, did any survive?
Oh yes. I mean, a lot of them went to different countries. They went to Belgium, they went to America.
But those that remained in Germany?
Very few remained in Germany.
So they had
But my uncle Julius died, and I've still got, to this day, the card from Auschwitz, where my parents sent parcels to him. My father altogether, and my parents were different. Well, they were nice. My father, when he was a double refugee in Sweden, went to the Red Cross and looked through the lists, to find people he knew, and asked the Red Cross to send him parcels. And he had nothing. I want to tell you, I mean, by the time we arrived in Sweden, we only had the clothes we were wearing. And he asked the Red Cross to send parcel to the people he knew. And years later, many years later, in 1956, I met people in London, young girls of my own age at that time, and when I said my name, they said, "You sent us parcels to Bergen-Belsen." I said, I didn't do anything. But it was my father, he had done it. And when we looked through my parents' things after the war, after they died, I found a receipt from the Red Cross where my father had sent them a considerable sum of money after the war. So we had, you know, they were, my parents were politically well aware. If you want message to people, it is watch, which is the same as I get my kids, watch the political situation where you are. Read the newspapers, follow the media, see what's going on. Don't be blind to what's happening in front of your noses. Always be politically aware. I think that's very true for today.
It really is. Well, I'm so grateful, Ruth. And please God, you should just have mazel and brocha and nachas from your family.
We do. And we are very lucky. We have been exceptionally exceptionally fortunate in that respect.
Well, Ruth, it's been the greatest honor and privilege to be with you today.
Okay.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
So Ruth, you have the original letters and postcards?
So this is written from Berlin by my uncle Julius in 1940, towards the end of April 1941, and he writes about, I hope everything goes well with you, and I have now heard that there's a possibility of going to USA, probably across from Gothenburg, and if he could make things possible for him. But unfortunately he was caught, as I said earlier on, and he was taken to Auschwitz, where my parents sent him parcels, and this is why I knew how dangerous the Germans were. And here he's sending a receipt still from Birkenau, which was next to Auschwitz. He has received their parcel, but then by 1943 he was dead. And that was in Auschwitz. That's all that we know.
And Ruth, you have a passport of your mother?
Well,
Danish?
It's just a Danish passport of
But
my
it's-
mother. It's not exactly. She was a sweet-looking lady, that was for sure.
But it's wonderful that you've kept these documents.
Yeah.
And, it's,
And
Ruth,
these
it's
things,
very valuable, I must tell you. You must,
these things are lying in my sideboard drawer, where I have all the tablecloths for Shabbos. And they're lying there for a very good reason, which is I know how we have been blessed and how lucky we are, and I'll never forget it. And if you are well and living in what's still a Western country and reasonably well fed, please be aware of how fortunate you are.
Ruth, thank you so much.